We can now bring in Andrew Smith, historian of modern France and senior lecturer at Queen Mary University, who was listening to Bayrou's statement there with me. What did you make of what the Prime Minister had to say, where he essentially called out the left for attempting to take the battle and the problems France has out on the streets?
A really big surprise announcement there. Of course, I was joking earlier on about 49.3 and forcing things through Parliament. Of course, what Francois Bayrou has sought permission to do is enact 49.1. That means they will hold this sort of vote of confidence, a sort of back me or sack me process on the 8th of September, preempting that big movement, that big blockage campaign on the 10th of September. So this is an attempt to bring things back into Parliament, to make people kind of realise their responsibilities and try to kind of sort things out within the Parliament. Now, in terms of his message, look, I mean, he said all this before for the last, 20 odd years. Well, you might say the last 40 odd years he's been in politics. But certainly it sounds a lot like he said on the 15th of July in his speech. We've heard these. If you're one of those few, those happy few that sat and watched his Facebook Live or his YouTube videos he made, he said much of these same things. Debt as a chronic illness. France trying to keep its head up amid a turbulent sea of global struggles. And the message really was here that the country has to spend less, and that France has to work more as a result, to spend less and produce more. Now, that's his solution. That's what we've looked at. But as he said, to try and counteract this idea of taking things to the streets, he said, let's take it back to Parliament. And so, back me or sack me on the 8th of September. It's a big old day down in the National Assembly.
But won't it be a risky move, the fact that he's doing this to take it back to Parliament, because the government could end up shooting itself in the foot? I mean, this is something that Emmanuel Macron did exactly last year.
Absolutely. Yes, it's not dissolving Parliament, so we will still have the same kind of process. We won't have any more elections, but I will probably guess, for me, unless something radically changes, unless there is some big movement, it looks to me like everything already is ranged against Bayrou's government and its budget plan. Look, he's tried to win round kind of social actors like the unions, but already we know he's not going to, for example, the CFDT kind of Université, the big summer thing tomorrow. We looked at this, he said, for the last 20 years, debt's being added. Well, people will say to him, rightly enough, I think, well, who's been in charge for the last 8 years? There is really not much to pull on to win people round. So this does look a very, very risky bet. And I would, if I were a betting man, it's what I say he might well lose.
We'll see what happens come the September 8th. But I want to ask about the current climate, because he did talk about divisions within Europe, failing to speak with a unified voice. This, of course, comes weeks after we had Ursula von der Leyen, who struck a trade deal with the United States. Bayrou was actually quite outspoken about how Europe essentially bent the knee to Washington. At the same time, we're going to have the French president who wants to continue sending funds to Ukraine, continue to arm Ukraine if there is ever a ceasefire deal reached with Russia. At one point, how will the government justify making these cuts, these savings, while at the same time continuing to arm a country that is not in Europe, that is not in NATO?
I think it will be recourse to languages of sovereignty. It will continue to be. We know that Emmanuel Macron used this language in his last presidential run. He spoke of the need for strategic autonomy. We've seen him question, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this idea of, where NATO leadership was going and a need to reinvest in, securing a Europe which can protect its people. And I think it will be pushed really at this idea of saying this is not about simply supporting a country which is not in Europe. This is about the sort of the territorial integrity of Europe. This is about recognizing that Russia does not stop at Ukraine in terms of territorial demands. It's about recognizing that attacks against Europe's borders and war in mainland Europe is a reality that we're facing today. At the
But
same
Andrew,
time, I
if I
think
could
it's
just
talking
jump in
about
on your
ideas about
point,
economics.
Andrew, if I can jump in on your point, which you're making there, in terms of, for example, defense purchases for Ukraine, today Kyiv said it wants to ask allies for $1 billion dollars per month of defense purchases from the United States. So we've had the French president who's spoken about Europe standing on its own, but at the end of the day, it's the US who wants to sell its weapons but get Europe to pay.
It's a discussion about debt, it's a discussion about trade. It's a difficult one in terms of realizing these things. But I think at the same time, France is no slouch in terms of selling weapons and selling all the rest of it. It's one of the largest arms dealers in the world. And so I'm certain that French weapons producers will look to wet their beak as well. This is not something I think to be sold away in terms of basic trade. I think that language will be about sovereignty and production and investment in France. We heard already in that speech today about reshoring production, about looking to see that France can produce all that it needs in terms of industry. So for me, that's a language of sovereignty, which I think is consistent with the politics of Macronism since certainly the last presidential election. So I think France will be kind of resolute in its support for Ukraine, trying to push and lead a European response to this. Again, underlining the fact that they can't rely on shifting American whims in terms of this quite vital, I think, existential security policy.
How do you think the far right is going to react based on what they've heard from the Prime Minister today?
It's going to be a challenge, I think, because we know that the far right will be frequently pushing for likely a vote of censure. It's not really in their interest to keep Francois Bayrou in place. This is almost something that they would welcome because they can bring down the government and cause all the kind of problems that they might want without ever having to contribute anything positive. And we've seen already they're going to be putting a counter-proposal budget to Bayrou. It would be surprising if this is something the government's able to accept. I think it's going to be about leveraging the idea of chaos to their maximum electoral advantage. That is what I think the reaction will be.
If the far right sells it to their electorate that these 44 billion euros is essentially an austerity budget, won't that make them more popular when they look to the presidency down the line?
I think absolutely it will. This is the difficulty of the kind of the politics of that type of demagoguery, that when you look at these rather fantasy budgets, as we've seen in previous years, they often don't stack up. They're not always intended to make fiscal sense. But more than ever, the far right is looking at targeting the presidency, looking at really making a run at election. And I think this will be the big problem when suddenly fantasy numbers and theories about debt really come crunching home. So I think this will be a moment where they will sell this as an austerity budget. They will promise untold millions of investment, but in reality, those will be fantasy numbers designed for short-term political gain.
Andrew Smith, thank you so much for joining us on the program today with your analysis. More news coming up. Stay with us.